Okay, welcome to the August Mississippi PowerShell user group meeting. This month we've got SharePoint MVP Todd Klindt, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Todd.
Thank you, thank you. So I think I just drank water, I got a cough. All right, now that I've nearly choked and gotten that out of the way. Hi, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for inviting me in. I'm not really a PowerShell guy. I'm a SharePoint guy, and Mike and Ron were kind enough to give me some time tonight to talk about this stuff, so I appreciate that. Hopefully you can all see my well-manicured PowerPoint deck here. I don't, my PowerShell skills compared to what you guys have are lacking. My PowerPoint skills are even worse, so be prepared for some pretty cruddy slides. First, I've got my vanity slide here. I am that handsome devil in the corner over there. I have been a SharePoint MVP since 2006, so I've got 10 years under my belt now. If I count all my little dealies over there, I've got 10 of them. For those of you that aren't familiar with the MVP program, it's for people, Microsoft throws people like me a bone for going out and evangelizing their products for free. So things like this, speaking, writing. I've written parts of 6 books on SharePoint. And one of the things that I always get to do when I write the books on SharePoint is do the PowerShell chapters, because I'm a big PowerShell fan. So that's kind of how this whole thing started. And at the end of this slide, I'll talk a little more about that. I've got a personal blog at toddklindt.com/blog. If you want to skip to the blog posts that are about PowerShell, you can go to toddklindt.com/PowerShell, and that'll take you to all those that are in that category. I work for the greatest web hosting company in the world, Rackspace, and I work on the SharePoint team, and you can find out what SharePoint things we have at sharepoint.rackspace.com, but we do a bunch of other things. Our Microsoft products are at www.rackspace.com/Microsoft, and then we do everything else. We do Linux and MongoDB and email of 14 different varieties and all kinds of stuff. And they, 3.5 years ago, lovingly acquired the company that I worked for, SharePoint 911, and I've been happily a Rackspace employee ever since. You can email me at todd.klindt@rackspace.com. The easier the question, the more likely you are to get an answer, and the more likely you are to get a correct answer. So keep that in mind when you're shooting me an email. I'm also on Twitter because I like to waste time when I'm not looking at cute videos of cats or pandas on the internet. I use Twitter to waste time, and you can tweet me at Todd Klindt. And I do a weekly podcast. It's mostly on SharePoint, but over the last couple of years I've kind of broadened my horizons, and I talk about Windows Phone and Windows 10 and Windows Server. PowerShell, for the longest time I had the PowerShell tip of the week during my podcast because I did a lot with PowerShell. That is Monday night at 8:30 Central, so it was 24 hours ago. And you can find out all the information on that at toddklindt.com/netcast. You can also go out to YouTube to youtube.com/toddklindtnetcast and see the other ones. So I didn't put it in here, but while we were coming up here, Mike was kind of talking about how I got into PowerShell. He made the observation that I've been doing PowerShell longer than him, which is cool until you realize that I still don't do it as well as he does. So he's been doing it less time and doing it better. But I've been doing SharePoint for 12 years now. I've been doing SharePoint since the first version of SharePoint, which was SharePoint 2001. Though I didn't start really doing that until 2002, 2003. But I am, by nature, a very lazy individual. I like to think of it as efficient, but lazy is probably every bit as appropriate. And when I was doing the SharePoint farms back in the SharePoint 2003 days and the SharePoint 2007 days, I found myself doing the same tasks over and over again, and so I started scripting them. And back then, SharePoint had a built-in tool that was originally AWS ADM, and then with the later versions STS ADM, and it was a command line tool written by the SharePoint team to do command line stuff with PowerShell or with SharePoint. And I got to be pretty good at it. The very first book chapter that I wrote for SharePoint was on STS ADM. The very first magazine article I ever wrote about SharePoint was about STS ADM. My very first big speaking gig was at TechEd 2007, and it was on STS ADM. STS ADM had treated me very, very well. I was thinking about getting a tattoo, very, very, tasteful thing, but a little something on the lower back there about STS ADM because it had been such a great tool for me. And then sometime in 2009, as an MVP, I was out of Redmond, and they were telling us all about the new stuff that was going to come with SharePoint 2010, and they're like, we have got great news. We're getting rid of STS ADM, and everything's going to PowerShell. And I remember sitting there thinking, if I throw my chair at him, do I immediately get kicked out, or is there like an appeal process? Because at that point, PowerShell just intimidated the pants off of me. It was complicated, and it had objects and whatever the heck an object is. And I remember being really worried because STS-ADM had been like this goose that was laying golden eggs for me, and now I wasn't going to be smart enough to do SharePoint anymore. I was going to have to go get a job where I got calluses on my hands or something. It was horrible. So I went through all the stages of grief, the bargaining and the anger and all that, and when I finally moved to acceptance and got understood that I was going to have to get up to speed on PowerShell, I went out and bought what was then and might still be the best PowerShell book in existence, PowerShell in Action by Bruce Payette. And myself and one of my SharePoint buddies, Shane Young, both bought copies of this book and started on page 1 and started learning PowerShell. And I think I got to page 7 before I fell asleep, because it was all, I mean, it's a great book, and as I look back, we were just talking before the thing started, it's on PowerShell 2. It was written in 2007. Still is relevant today as it was 8 years ago when it was written. But that wasn't the best way to learn PowerShell, at least not for me. The best way was to actually do things. So I started doing that with the SharePoint beta, started learning how to do things that would take me 30 seconds in the SharePoint administrative interface. I could plug out in PowerShell in about 2 hours the first few times till I got up to speed on it. But then once I got up to speed on it, I'm like, holy cow, this PowerShell thing is awesome. So then I started doing PowerShell talks and all that. And I think the first time, and I don't remember if Mike and I actually met that time, but Mike saw me at a SharePoint Saturday in Atlanta a few years ago doing a talk on PowerShell and SharePoint. And so this talk today is a very similar talk, but it's going to be about PowerShell with SharePoint Online as opposed to SharePoint on-prem. And before we talked before the thing started, a couple of people in the chat room were talking about the limitations of SharePoint and all that. I will talk about some of the ways to get past some of those. So I bring that up because in my head, PowerShell is a SharePoint tool. Where that's really not the case. So when I use PowerShell with other things, I always look at it through the SharePoint lens. So if you hear me talking crazy stuff about PowerShell here, it's because I'm used to doing it with the SharePoint glasses on. But for the agenda for this talk, as I'm contractually obligated to put agenda slides in, I'm going to talk about the SharePoint Online commandlets, the ones that you download from Microsoft, the Azure commandlets that you can also get from Microsoft, and then using PowerShell with a little thing we SharePoint guys call CSOM, the client-side object model. That's going to be important. Those of you that were complaining about how SharePoint didn't do PowerShell very well remotely, CSOM is the thing. But don't be running out to Google right now and checking this stuff out. Sit through the presentation. I got a nice build-up going. I like to build the story up a little bit. So we'll start with the PowerShell for SharePoint Online. My biggest word of advice with this is hopefully you deal well with disappointment. That's kind of the lesson here. I first did this talk a year and a half ago, something like that. And it was one of those talks. I've been doing the PowerShell with SharePoint on-prem talk for a while, years and years and years. And one of the folks at the Australian SharePoint conference or something like, hey, you should do this talk. You should do it with PowerShell with SharePoint Online. I think that would be great. The cloud's a great thing. Everybody's very excited about it. I'm like, that'd be awesome. Absolutely, sign me up. I'll do it twice. It'll be great. And then I started researching it and found out there was nothing there. It's just a bad story. And so then when I started writing this, setting this up several years ago, I had to augment some of this stuff. So the first thing we're going to talk about is PowerShell with SharePoint Online. Like I said, it allows basic manipulation of SharePoint Online, and I've got some other slides. But don't go into this thinking you're going to be able to do crazy things, because if you're watching this, you're probably a PowerShell meister, and you're probably used to making PowerShell stand up and dance and doing reflection and all kinds of crazy things. You will be able to do none of that with SharePoint Online, with the SharePoint Online commandlets. So just get used to disappointment. Again, the back half of this deck will help out with that, but it's just not where it needs to be yet. There's a lot of room for improvement. You can download those executables in the link here, and you can download that and install that. It's just a module that installs into PowerShell. And Jason's saying he had the same exposure with Azure. Well, then when one of my big finishes is Azure, Jason, you're going to be doubly disappointed. So you may need a stiff drink or something like that. I don't know what to tell you. So here's what it looks like. If you're still running Windows 7, you need to install the new Windows Management Framework 3.0. If you're on Windows 8 or Windows 10, you don't need to do that. It's all built in. So download and install the SharePoint Online Management Shell. And when you fire it up, if you get this nasty looking message at the bottom, no module name was found, you've done everything wrong. The way my coworkers describe this is the screen is bleeding, blood all over the screen. I kind of like that. If you get that error message, that means you need to do the run as, and you have to do that in 7, 8, and 10, and that makes that error message go away. And if you do, so when you install it, it's going to create the shortcut for you for the SharePoint Online Management Shell. Most of you guys probably have your own profile set up to bring things in and out. Jason Himmelstein's in the chat room, good friend of mine. He's got a great PowerShell module build-up thing he should link in the chat room here, and it loads a bunch of these modules for you. So if you want to do that, then you can do import module Microsoft Online SharePoint PowerShell. Notice I had to throw in the whole disable name checking. I'm going to do a demo here at some point during this when I get tired of talking. They have at this point one commandlet that has an unapproved verb, and they have one that uses the word update. And if you don't do the disabled name checking, it'll yell at you. You'll get yellow on the screen. And I've never thought this through, but if the red is blood, I don't want to think about what the yellow is. But so you have to do the disabled name checking thing to get that error message to go away. And Jason just posted that in the chat room. I don't know if the recording will catch the chat room or not, but if you go to github.com/Jason Himmelstein/PowerShell, and that will give you his startup script, and it's great. He's a SharePoint guy like I am, so loads of all the SharePoint things. Mike in the chat room is saying, it's right there, folks, get verb. Yeah, I think one of the things, so you guys all know it because you're PowerShell folks. One of the things that I love about PowerShell is the structure. And I say that because with the tools that I had used before, STS-ADM and all the VBS stuff and all that, I could never remember with STS-ADM if it was, enum site or enum sites, enum all web, enum, all this kind of stuff. So the fact that the PowerShell is so rigid in its verb and singular noun and prefixes and all that is one of the things that I absolutely love about PowerShell. So, but as you guys know, at Microsoft, the PowerShell team, Jeff Snover and his folks, they all report up under the Windows team, and they make the rules. And then every little product group has their poor unfortunate college intern that has to write their commandlets. And I think they sometimes don't get the memo, because I know the last time I installed the SQL PowerShell commandlets, they had a couple that were that had invalid names. This one does. It's painful. I don't know why they don't fix that. I don't know why people aren't getting fired, getting stack ranked out when they do that kind of stuff. But there is one, the upgrade one, that will flare up on you. So here is what the SharePoint Online, the SharePoint Online module looks like. Ignore the title at the top. I was using the wrong window when I did that. This is all of the commandlets. There are 41 of them. 41 blazing commandlets that you get with this. Not a lot in there, and we will go through some of these in more depth, but this is it. Now, I say this again, I'm a SharePoint on-prem guy and have been forever. The last time I counted, if you had SharePoint 2013 and you had the enterprise SKU of SharePoint Server, I think there's a touch over 800 commandlets. So when you start playing with those, I mean, it's you're doing all kinds of filtering by noun and lots of more and lots of naps and things like that as you're looking for commandlets with SharePoint on-prem. And I remember the first time I did this, I did a git command module, and I piped it through more, and it didn't even scroll. And I'm like, there's got to be a typo. I must have screwed something up. I must be loading up the wrong list. No, this is it. And I will tell you, for better or for worse, this is actually better than it was a year ago. A year ago, there was like 35 or 37 commandlets. Now there's 41. So we're getting about one a quarter. So by 2038, we should have 100 or so for us to use. But The good news about this is when you look at these commandlets, it doesn't take you very long to figure out what they do. It's not very intimidating. They're pretty self-explanatory, and they're not going to get away from you. You're not going to get intimidated by them. But this is all of, and like I said in the previous slide, it's basic things: adding users to site, creating site collections, things like that. We've got some for looking for upgrades and testing site collections, things like that, but there's just not a lot there. I think for the most part, the only ones I use very often are get SPO site, get SPO user is another one, and this is one way to, I think you can restore, you can restore a deleted site collection. I've used that one before, but there's just not a lot in here. So this is the whole get used to disappointment piece, 41 commandlets, no extra charge. So before you can use any of this, you have to tell the commandlets what your namespace is, what you're doing, and so you use the connect SPO service commandlet to do that, and you pass it the URL to your admin tenant. So what you don't do is provide it the URL to your main site collection or your front, whatever the easy one is, the one that you always try first. That's the wrong one. You want the one that's got the -admin in the site collection name. So in this one, I spoke at the Microsoft Ignite conference in May in Chicago, and I did a pre-conference session on OneDrive for Business, and that was a hybrid thing. So SharePoint on-prem, SharePoint online, and I used a bunch of PowerShell in that, and I co-presented that with a friend of mine, Laura Rogers. And at one point, I was covering the stuff that we're covering in this session, and I got all geeked out, and I had a PowerShell window up, and I'm like, oh, you can do this, you can pipe to this, you can loop through this, and she's over there going, I think they've got it. I think we need to move on to some other stuff, because I was just in there enjoying my PowerShell. But that's what that URL is, the Ignite OneDrive for Business pre-day session. So to connect up, you have to use the -admin site collection. And then the credential, that is my admin credential for that, and then it's going to pop you and give you a password prompt. And then once you get in, you get the box down there at the bottom, and you'll notice it doesn't say anything. It's the whole, back when you're using Unix, if no news is good news, that's exactly how this one is. So if you connect and you don't get anything back, you've got connected. If you can't get connected because your user doesn't have permission or whatever, it will yell at you and bleed on the screen. And Lori Gowan, she's listened to this. She was in that session. she saw that. If Laura and I would have been like sitting at a table, she would have been kicking me into the table to stop talking about PowerShell. So what do we do? Mostly just look around, mostly just poke things. Of the 41 commandlets, I kind of broke it down. 2 of them are just connecting and disconnecting, just getting things set up. We've got 4 that are for creation, new an SPO site, add SPO user, those kind of things. 6 set commandlets, so we've got things like set users, and set some of this stuff for SPO sites. So there's not a lot you can set, but you can see that the emphasis is not on doing things, it's more on getting things. 7 remove or delete commandlets, 5 that are upgrade, repair, test, things like that, and then 14 get. So we're looking at nearly half of the commandlets are just read-only, getting site collections and things like that. There's just not a lot there. I suspect at some point some executive at Microsoft has a checklist that says SharePoint Online must have PowerShell commandlets, and they've got a checkbox there, and it's not a very great tool for most users. So this is what it looks like, and again, I'm going to jump in and do some demos, but a lot of times when I do this session, I'm doing it in person, and I don't trust the internet connection, or I don't have my stuff connected to the internet because I never know when my mom's going to IM me or something. And so I've got some screenshots, but we'll jump in and play with this a little bit here in a minute. So one of the first commandlets that I use for SharePoint on-prem is get SP site. The analogous commandlet for SharePoint Online is get SPO site. And that gives you that wonderful blob of text up there. So the default parameters that we get are the URL, the owner, and the storage quota in megabytes. You can see that we've got a bunch there. And I piped it through getMember just to show you how disappointing it all is. That object, there's just not much there. And you'll notice that a lot of those properties are get only. And there's just not a lot you can do. But those are the things that you can get if you're doing stuff with PowerShell there. So this is one of the things that I do. This gives you the full URLs because we've got this back here. It's got them all truncated, and by definition, all your SharePoint Online sites are going to have the same prefixy stuff, so they all kind of look the same. But here we've got get SPO site with the URL, and that kind of gives you the full URLs. You can see there. So this was a demo. I kind of did this to pander to my audience. I'm absolutely not above that at all. I usually suck up to my audience any way that I can. Well, the last time, I speak at a SharePoint conference in Stockholm, Sweden, most every year. They're not having it this year, but most years. And so whenever I do that, I always make sure like my desktop is the Swedish flag or some monument in Sweden. So when I was getting my demo set up for this, I did the get SP site select URL so we could see what I have out there. And I just kind of showed creating a new site collection in SharePoint Online, and I called it, the root /sites MSPSUG rocks. I set myself as the owner, and I'm going to come back to why that owner name is curious here in a minute. I set a storage quota of 700 megabytes. That seems like a good place to start. I gave it a title of Virtua et Armis, which from what I understand from a very, very quick Googling, that is the Mississippi State motto. And then I gave it the template of just a regular team site. And let that churn. Now, since we're doing this with SharePoint Online and not on-prem, you've got this weird combination of async and synchronous things going on. So sometimes things take a long time because PowerShell's waiting for SharePoint Online to get back, and sometimes things come back before they're actually done because a job's being queued out in SharePoint Online. So as you start playing with these, there's some chicken and the egg things going on. You just got to kind of be patient sometimes. This particular one took a while, but then I immediately did a get SPO site, select URL, and you can see there towards the bottom, I should have highlighted that, but it's right above 4 or 5 from the bottom. My site collection showed up, and then I went out to the web, and there it is, and it came up. So that's kind of some basic stuff that you can do. One of the things that I wanted to talk about in this screen, I think I can mark up. So when I logged into the tenant, I guess this one will work too, you can see that, I'm trying to draw my screen here, you can see a lot of the identities here are in this format. And that's usually what SharePoint Online looks like, user at your tenant name.onmicrosoft.com. But you'll also notice that I have a few that look like this that are at odfbdemo.com. And when I created my new site collection, I called it that. I used the same namespace. What I'm doing there, and this is another way to exercise your PowerShell muscle, is I am synchronizing an Active Directory domain into Azure AD and SharePoint Online. And so I'm using Azure Active Directory Connect, and I'm setting up a DIR-sync job essentially, and pushing those identities out there. And those identities are, for the most part, first-class identities out there in SharePoint Online. And I bring this up because when we start looking at the next set of commandlets, this is a great opportunity to flex your PowerShell muscle because a lot of these things can be administrated for better or for worse through PowerShell. And I've got a great story about how I used PowerShell for bad. But that's why we're seeing this. And again, the tools are out there. Jason in the chat room is talking about how he's trying to do that now. I would be curious what your experience is, what works, what doesn't work. As a SharePoint guy, this hybrid thing of Windows accounts being synced out to Azure AD and mixing and matching SharePoint on-prem and SharePoint Online, that's kind of what's got me excited now. It's kind of the thing that I'm doing. So I'd be curious now or later, Jason, to hear your tales of woe or your tales of triumph. All right, so that is that. So I will fire up a PowerShell prompt here, and we'll do some kind of just basic demo stuff. I will try to do it in such a way that I don't expose any of my passwords or anything like that to you fine folks. Let me fire this up. Boo, if I was that guy. And you guys can't see it yet. I'll share it out here once I get it sized and all that. And if you guys have any questions, you guys are chatting there in the chat room. I do this every week. I'm pretty good at handling the distractions and all that. So if you guys want to shout out your questions in the chat room, I will follow along and answer them in line. All right, so let's come over here Share program. And where's it at? I don't see the program at 1%. Oh, that's a help screen. That doesn't help any. Oh, that's funny. So I've got PowerShell up, but Link apparently doesn't want to let me share it. Mike, has that been a problem for people before?
I think it's an issue if you're running PowerShell elevated.
And I am. I just thought of that. Yeah, and I got to run it elevated to do all the stuff for this.
Normally it will let you share it, but it won't let somebody else drive, I think is the issue that me and Ron have had.
Share the monitors, what Ron's saying. Okay. That's, as a professional presenter, that scares the pants off.
Oh, no, I see your PowerShell now.
Oh, okay. So, all right. So I'm sharing. Okay.
Yeah, it looks like it was on your other monitor and you drug it over.
I did, but I thought I was sharing PowerShell and not the whole monitor. Boy, that could have been embarrassing. Dodged a bullet there. Okay. All right. So this, I just fired it up, and now I got to get my notes over there. Just fired it up. So I've got the. I used the shortcut that it created, so I don't need to load the module, but I do need to connect. So, yes, that's the right one. And no, that's not the right one. There we go. Okay, so this has got, but this also has the Azure ones in here, which is why I'm getting confused. All right, so the URL that I need to use is again the admin site collection. So that, and then I didn't pass it username and password, so it's going to prompt me for that. You can do the whole credential thing and store credentials and do it that way. I decided I probably wasn't going to be able to do that without somehow exposing my password to you guys, so I prefer not to have all that fun. So again, no feedback, so I'm in here. Get SPO site, so that's all the stuff that I showed you guys before, and then get member gets us the members for those SharePoint site collections. Again, just not a lot that you can do when you're in here. We can poke around a little bit. I noticed that a few of these commandlets, and it might be I don't do the SharePoint Online stuff as much as I kind of wish I did, but they don't act the way that I would expect them to. So part of the great thing of PowerShell is, chaining things together and passing objects and all that great stuff. So when I was in the past trying to set up some of these demos, I was like, all right, so an obvious one is to do a get SPO site. Okay, so that gives me, so then another one is get SPO. Oh yeah, so here's another great thing. So one of the things I always tell folks when you're doing PowerShell, any PowerShell, SharePoint, Exchange, Notepad, whatever. If you're using a new commandlet, the first thing you should do is help on that commandlet and just kind of see what it does, make sure it does the thing that you're looking for. And you look at this and you're like, oh boy, there's not a lot there. But then the second thing I tell everybody to do is hit the up arrow, space tab, or space dash E tab, and that gives us the examples, because I like to see, that's how I learn best, by stealing other people's code. There are none, and this is sadly quite common with the SharePoint Online commandlets. There's just not there, and you're like, oh well, you just need to update help. Yeah, I updated help, and it didn't do anything. And I did reload these. I had these loaded on this box before I reloaded the new ones, and there's just not much there. So I was looking at get SPO site. I'm like, all right, that looks good. Another one that I was looking for was help get SPO user, because again, I've been doing a lot of this hybrid stuff, and users are something I think about all the time. And I'm looking at this. I'm like, okay, so this is good. I give it a site. That makes sense. It's got to know what sites to get the users on. I can do a pipe bind. Perfect. So then there's examples. All right. Yeah, there's no examples. And this one's even worse because it actually says to type examples and there are no examples. The lazy guy that wrote get SPO site didn't even tease me, but these people teased me and said, oh yeah, by the way, do the examples thing. And then there are no examples. So that takes a certain evil. This is the kind of guy that probably, sets people bags of flaming poo on people's steps, things like that. But I said, okay, I was undeterred, so I said, okay, I will do just a bunch of users. I want to do something that throws a bunch of text on the screen and impresses and confuses the fine folks that I'm going to be presenting in front of tonight. So I'm like, we will do this. So this will get all of my sites, and then for each one of those sites, get the user. Well, except that it won't. It's looking for a site, and I just passed it a site. I'm like, all right, well, no problem. So I can do get SPO site, and then since I need the whole thing, select URL. So I'll grab this one, and then get SPO site. All right, so I really am getting that object. I see people typing in the chat room, so maybe they can tell me what I'm doing wrong. This is awesome. But again, try to do it, and it's just not working the way that I expect things to work. So things aren't getting enumerated correctly behind the scenes. I bring this up again because you guys are PowerShell professionals. You know how PowerShell is supposed to work. This is more of the getting used to disappointment part of today's show. So just know that you got to do some of the stuff. So I imagine I could probably do something, and I haven't tested this, so maybe I shouldn't do this. I could probably do a for each. And I could say get SPO user. Let's see if that works. Well, it didn't immediately kick back to me. So there's just clumsy things like this inside of these commandlets, things that feel like they should work, but they don't work. And this is churning away, so I assume that it's actually going to work. So let me look back at my slides here quick and see if there's other things in there I wanted to look at. So I did a new one, selected all that. I think I lost them. I lose you guys?
I'm still here.
Okay.
I lost your whatever you were presenting. It says feel free to start presenting.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I was telling Mike I had some internet connection issues today, and I got the same thing that said the network things are presenting problems. So let me see if I can present that back again. Did I come back?
No, not yet.
All right. Let me know when that pops back up, and I will continue on. That was the internet's way of telling me that my demos were terrible. So yeah, Jason says he's had the same kind of problems.
So what was the name of the commandlet that you were trying to pipe to?
I was piping get SPO site and then hoping to take that object and pipe it through get SPO user. There's really no no way you do that in real life because you wouldn't want all that. But I was just trying to show piping them, and every time I tried to find a combination, it wouldn't actually work. So and I tried.
You could run the command I just put it, and it's got a bunch of aliases, but you could run that command and see if it would tell you if get SPO user accepts pipeline input.
It says that it does. It says it creates or supports an SP site pipe bind. All right. So I'm trying to. I'm back. Okay. So Link gave me you might not have the latest list participants. So this is a funny thing. I live in a college town, Iowa State University. I'm sure you guys have heard of it, big sports powerhouse. But so it's a town of about 60,000 people, and every year when the students show up, which is right now, the cable modem company has a tough time figuring out load and all that. So there's like a 2-week period at the beginning of the school year where my internet connection is terrible. So again, not a lot to demonstrate here. So I'm going to jump back to my slides. And of course, if the chat thing starts working again, you guys have something you want to see, shout it out, and I'll let you know. All right, so part 2 of how to connect. So we've got the disappointing and depressing SharePoint Online commandlets. A little less depressing and a little less disappointing are the Windows Azure AD or the MS Online commandlets. So that's another package that you need to download. You need to install the Sign-On Assistant, which is a separate download, and then install the Azure AD module itself. And that, again, so you can see I've got it done, and that installs on top of the SharePoint one. They all work together quite well. They make good use of the prefixes and all that, so everybody is happy together. Now this one is a little different because you don't have the tenant namespace with Azure like you do with SharePoint. So when you connect it, you use the Connect MS Online Service commandlet, but you don't have to pass it any parameters. You just sign in as a user and it gives you access to whatever that user has access to inside of Azure. And again, if you're like Jason, you've got this fancy, Jason Himmelstein, you've got this fancy profile script that loads everything up. Add module MS Online gets you all these commandlets. And I've got a screenshot there that I assume you guys can all see. The show's getting connected to that. You'll notice that I'm using the same account there, and I will come back to that in a minute. But that's the same account that I used. Now I'm just showing off by drawing them in PowerPoint. That's the same account that I connected to SharePoint Online with. We'll find out why in a minute. All right, so we had, 41 commandlets in SharePoint. We've got a little over 84 commandlets in the Azure commandlets. So there is some overlap with the SharePoint commandlets, but for the most part, the Azure stuff takes it a step further, and that's things like the licensing and federation and domains, things like that. So I talked about how I was doing the domain sync with Azure Active Directory Connect and using FIM and all that. These are where those commandlets come into play. These are where I can do those things. I can set domains and get domains and add synchronization partners and things like that. Play with ADFS a little bit. So as you're starting to do those synchronization things, these are the commandlets that you want to have installed. And they're a little handier for that kind of thing. So we've got some familiar friends. I've connected to the Microsoft Online Service, that's the top up there, and then I did a get MS Online user, which again sort of gives some of the same output as the get SPO user did, and that's because they're the same users. In the background, SharePoint Online and Office 365 are using Azure Active Directory. So it's not spelled out real well. It doesn't always make it obvious, but that's what's going on. And if you remember, I had the odfbdemo.com domain, which was the one that I was syncing up, and then the Ignite OD Preday thing, which is the other set of users. So it's all the same users, but now they're showing up as Azure AD users. And now we've got other columns. We've got things like is licensed, and we'll play with that here in a second also. But again, it's not always obvious, but SharePoint Online and Exchange Online and all those are using Azure AD in the background. So any of the PowerShell commandlets you can use to manage users in Azure, you can leverage to use to manage users in the SharePoint and Exchange. Also, so this is one of my fun gotchas. So way back in the day when I was young and naive and all that, I was so one of the things, I love this quote, one of the greatest quotes ever. There's a big SharePoint team at Rackspace, as you can imagine, and somebody sent out an email to the entire team. Hey, does anybody know a way to do blah in SharePoint? Set something, configure something, I don't remember what it was. And they got crickets back. Nobody responded at all. So like an hour later, the guy's like, come on, doesn't anybody know the answer to this? And one of my coworkers replied back to everybody and said, you should do what I do. When I have a problem that nobody knows the answer to, I just send out an email and say that it can't be done in PowerShell, and then I sit back and wait for Todd to show me how to do it in PowerShell. And so with my coworkers, I've kind of gotten that reputation as the guy that loves to learn how to do things in PowerShell. So 100 years ago, way back, 5 or 6 years ago, I was setting some disaster recovery stuff inside of SharePoint. And inside of SharePoint on-prem, you've got a bunch of databases, and you can set up failover partners in SQL. So you can say, this is the primary SQL server that it's on, but here's the failover one. And you could set that for every database except for the main database in SharePoint, the configuration database. So if you're in Central Admin, every one of those databases has that entry except for the config DB. This looks like a job for PowerShell. So I get out and I get on my big boy pants and I start my transcript up and I start poking around these different objects. And sure enough, the config database object has a, I forget what the name of the property is now, but replication DB or something like that, secondary DB, and it's a set and a get. So I'm like, this is awesome. So I'm all excited now. Now I'm going to blog this. So I'm kind of poking it so I can get out there and look like a really smart guy to the PowerShell world. And again, this was a long time ago. I should have known better, but I'm trying to find a way to automate this. So I'm doing, all right, you can go do a get SP database. We need to find the config database. It's almost always called SharePoint_config. So get SP database where, $_name equals SharePoint config, and then pipe that through and do whatever. And as I'm building this out, I ran that command, and as all of you PowerShell folks know, when you're trying to do a comparison in PowerShell, you don't use the equal sign. You use -eq. I did not know that then. So when I ran get SP database pipe where object database name equal SharePoint_config, PowerShell went, I am happy to name all of your databases SharePoint_config. And it walked through my entire SharePoint farm and renamed all of my databases SharePoint_config. So to SharePoint's benefit, it handled it really well, and it didn't immediately explode. It uses GUIDs in the background a lot to identify databases, so I was able to continue on with that. But that was one of my first big oopsies with PowerShell and SharePoint. And fortunately, that was in a VM environment, and nothing was lost. But I had a similar. So Mike's like, "What if?" I don't know that what if would have worked in that case because I don't know where I would have put the what if because it was the where clause that did it. And anyway, so I had a very very similar experience here recently with SharePoint Online. So doing this thing for Ignite in May, and a couple months before that, Microsoft sets us up with this tenant, and they've got this prefab tenant that they give out that's got a bunch of users in it and a bunch of site collections, and they're all formatted, a bunch of content, and it's a great thing. And so Laura and I started working on that. We set up directory synchronization and all those kind of things, and got everything going well. And then a month before the Ignite conference, her and I were at the SharePoint Evolution conference in London. And one of our friends from Microsoft, Jeremy Thake, was up doing the keynote, and he was doing a demo, and he was doing something in SharePoint Online. And everybody in the room knew the default password for the SharePoint Online account, so it's just password1. And so Jeremy's doing his deal, and the login prompt pops up, and it's the admin user, and he goes over and pastes the password in. And so you could tell, like, there was this unspoken question: why did you paste the password in? Why didn't you just type it in? And he's like, he noticed it, and he said, I've been doing these a bunch, and I've had a couple instances where as soon as my tenant name comes up, somebody in the audience on his laptop logs into my tenant with the well-known username and the well-known password and screws with me. And he said in one case, somebody deleted everything. So Jeremy was up on stage doing a keynote, logged in, clicked something, and all of his stuff was gone because it was a well-known password. So he's like, so now I change all my passwords. And I'm thinking, man, I cannot believe people like that exist on Earth. They weren't held enough as a child. I don't even know what would possess somebody to do that. So the very first session after that, I go to a session with another friend of mine, Kirk Evans, who does a bunch of this kind of stuff. And I'm like, man, can you believe that story that Jeremy told? And Kirk's like, yeah, it's happened to me 2 or 3 times. I'm like, get out. So now I'm terrified because I've got this tenant that I'm going to be doing this all-day session on, and it's got all the default usernames and passwords. So I'm terrified. I start sweating a little bit, but I'm like, this is a great job for PowerShell. Oh, this is genius. So I go out to a prompt, and again, I haven't got any clue what I'm doing with all this. So I do, get command star user blah. So I see how to get all my users. Get command star password, and we've got a commandlet here, set MSOL user password. And I'm like, I am the smartest man alive, and there's just no getting around it. This is proof positive. I'm the smartest man alive. So I look at the use for this, set the username, all that. One thing that's interesting about this is you set the password in plain text. You'll see that new password is a string, not a secure string. That one threw me for a loop. I didn't think they would let that out the doors at Microsoft, but they did. So I tested it on a couple users, and it did exactly what I wanted it to do. Reset the password. So what did I do then? Because I'm the smartest man alive and the most efficient, I did the old, get MSOL user, pipe set MSOL user password, and I think I've got a screenshot of it right here. So that's what I did. Get MSOL user, pipe get MSOL user password, dash new password, pass at word 2, because nobody expects that. And then I just leaned back and did one of these. That's right, hackers, come and get me. And for the most part, it worked. So I was working with Laura, and we had a OneNote that we were sharing that had our stuff in there. So I went and made a note in there so she would know how to log in with that. And everything was pretty peachy. And once again, I'd regained my crown as the smartest man alive. And then a couple of days before Ignite, I'm going through, I'm looking at all the stuff, and I'm going through my demos, and all of our synchronization is broken. Nothing has been synchronized in weeks, and nothing can talk to nothing, and SharePoint Online is mad, or Azure AD is mad at Windows AD, and Windows AD is mad at Azure AD, and I just can't figure out what's going on. So I spend a bunch of time, and I'm looking at event logs, and I'm triggering syncs and all that. Well, what I had done is I had changed every username in Microsoft Online, including the one that was configured to do the syncing locally. Yeah, so Jason's got it there. Service accounts, yes, that's absolutely what I did. I changed all my service accounts, and turns out I broke a bunch of stuff. So once again, I can't remember who it was I first heard it described PowerShell as kind of like fire. It's a great tool, but you gotta keep respect for it. This was one of those cases. And obviously, when I did this, 4 months ago or whenever it was I did it, I didn't take a screenshot of it because I didn't blog this or anything, because I was just not sure what my tenant, and I felt dirty, and I was typing it, and I was like, oh my God, please don't accidentally hit enter, please don't accidentally hit enter. But yeah, so the fix was I had to go back inside of FIM, the Forefront Identity Management, and I could see which username I had set up when I synced it, ran the wizard again, set it with a new password, did the force sync and all that. But that's just one of those things when you're using PowerShell, you get drunk on power with the looping and the piping, and all that kind of stuff happens. So I did want to share that story. So we're coming close. I told Mike I was going to keep this to about an hour. Do we have any demos we want to see in there? Do you want me to bring that up, or I kind of got screenshots for that, but I can bring that up if anybody wants to. But I kind of want to talk to this last part a little bit. So I don't see any typing in there, so I'll go ahead and go the third way. So the first way to use SharePoint Online with PowerShell is to use the disappointing, much maligned SharePoint Online commandlets. The next way is to use the Windows and Azure ones that open up a whole bunch more things that you can do, users and all that kind of stuff. Oh, I guess another thing I want to talk about now that I'm thinking about it. And this is another thing that you will likely have to do, and that I've had to do before, is this is licensed thing. So all these accounts sit in Azure AD, regardless of whether that user is using Azure or using SharePoint Online or Exchange Online or Lync or whatever. And as you guys know, the Office 365, you have to light up licenses for users to do things. So one of the things that I've set up for customers is putting their My Sites out in SharePoint Online, and when you do that, there's a kind of an onboarding process and all that. But one of the things you need to do is license them. So there are commandlets for that. I don't know if they show up in the list or not, but that's one of the things that you can automate. So one of the things that I've set up for people is, if you've got a user that you want to bring into this whole SharePoint Online deal, you should run a PowerShell script. That PowerShell script will put them in the Windows Active Directory group that SharePoint consumes for its audience. It will give them the license and then if you're only syncing a certain portion of your Active Directory up to Azure Active Directory, it will put them in that group, which is normally the same. It will force a sync, because by default that dir sync runs every 3 hours, so it will kick off that sync, then it will jump in and add that user, give them the right license. So this is just one of the many ways you can use PowerShell to automate processes and make tools. But the licensing thing is one that comes up a lot with Office 365. Okay, so the first way was the SharePoint snap-ins module. The second way was with the Azure module. The third way, the sneaky way, CSOM with PowerShell, and that is the client-side object model. Starting with SharePoint 2010 and really coming into its own with SharePoint 2013 is this idea of the client-side object model. And this was born out of the fact that now Microsoft is hosting SharePoint and they don't want people taking their SharePoint servers down. And they're trying to push the code off of the server and onto the client, running it in the web browser. And that's with a thing called CSOM, so people can write web parts and SharePoint apps and things like that that run in the browser instead of the server. Don't take the server down. It's the security is better, all that kind of stuff. Since PowerShell can do all that kind of stuff, now anything that developers can do with CSOM inside of their apps and their web pages and all that kind of stuff, we can do inside of PowerShell with CSOM, the same thing. So first off, it's very developer-y, so be afraid, it's code, and I openly mock developers, and PowerShell has made that tough because a lot of times developers are like, you use PowerShell, and that's really super close to being a developer, and I, of course, then can't speak to them anymore because I don't like them, but this is even more developer-y. So there's a couple of things that you need to do to get this to work. The easiest way is to download the SharePoint 2013 client SDK and install that, and that copies a group of DLLs into your local client, because you have to have these DLLs on the client to run this code. Or you can copy them from the server. The SDK is probably better. And I'll show these PS1 scripts later, but this is kind of how it looks when you run it. So this is a script called top of script that connects you to your tenant. Then I'll show you how to do that. And then one of the things you cannot do with the SharePoint command, it's one of the many lists of things you can't do, is get the subwebs of a site collection. And so this shows how to get a subweb. So you can see I've got a site, which is Aussie. I did this presentation in Australia last year, and then there's a web underneath that called hidden, and there's just no way I could have gotten that with the out-of-the-box commandlets. So what does that look like? The first one is this top of script PS1, and you'll notice that one's called -demo because I didn't put my password in there. But again, we're getting a username for a tenant. So in this case, it was Todd at toddklindt.onmicrosoft.com. I stole these slides from somebody else. Password, pass@word1, the URL. We're converting it to a secure string. These are the DLLs that we have to have loaded, and I have them in a temp directory, and that's why it's got this goofy path here. That's not how the client does it. And then here's how you connect. So you create a new client context, connect up to that, and pass that in there, and then that tests for the setting. So before this whole thing started, some folks were talking about how PowerShell with SharePoint was kind of rough because you actually had to run it on the server. That is correct. With on-premises SharePoint, to get the 800 and some commandlets that come with SharePoint, you have to run them on a SharePoint server and on the SharePoint server that's in the farm that you want to do. You can't install SharePoint on your desktop and do it that way. It doesn't work that way. But all of the things that I'm showing you here, the Get SPO Web and all these kind of things that work with SharePoint Online, also work with SharePoint On-Prem. Now, the authentication piece is a little different. This line 16 looks a little different, and I should put it in here, and I might have it on a later slide. But you can do this with your client. So with your Windows 7, 8, or 10 client, you can download that SharePoint 2013 SDK. You can write a script like this one, and with your on-premises SharePoint, you can authenticate against it with CSOM, and then do anything managerial with SharePoint with CSOM that the developers can do with code. So things like creating webs, creating site collections. Another piece of that is the CSOM. The things that you can do with CSOM is extended with different patches. So I forget what there was one, maybe April of this year or maybe April of last year, the SharePoint on-prem patch added a bunch more CSOM functionality, which for us is more functionality inside of SharePoint. So all of this stuff works with SharePoint Online, also works with SharePoint on-prem. So that was something we discussed earlier on. I stole all of these examples from a buddy of mine, Chris O'Brien, at SharePointNutsandBolts.com. He's got a couple of blog posts out there. And if you do a search for like SharePoint, PowerShell, CSOM, there's a bunch of those out there. But this is what that Get SPO Web looks like. Jumps on there, grabs the client context that we're already logged in as, and does some code, and then executes, sets up the query, executes that query. And again, now you're doing this, and it's the whole async, synchronous thing, so it acts a little squirrely sometimes, but it all works there, and it kicks out your code like that. So there's that. Get lists is another one. There's no good way to get lists with the default commandlets, but this tells you how to do that. And again, anything at this point now, anything that developers can do with the client-side object model, now we can do with PowerShell on clients against SharePoint on-prem or SharePoint Online. And that's that whole top of script. And that top of script PS1 is in this blog post. So you don't have to worry about copying that down or anything like that. He's got it all there. And I think these are also his, so you can get those. All right, so I don't have any demos set up for that, but we are now at the time you've all been waiting for, questions and answers, and I would appreciate it if you'd make them easy. Oh, so another thing I wanted to bring up, and I don't know if you guys have talked about this or not. I've got one of these adorable little Raspberry Pi 2s. So this is a little Internet of Things thing. It's got 1 gig of RAM. It's got some crazy Broadcom processor. But the crazy thing about this little guy is it runs Windows 10. And the primary way to get into this thing and make changes, PowerShell remoting. So this little box here that runs Windows 10, I think this thing sets you back $30-40, and then you can connect it with Visual Studio, connect it with PowerShell, and do amazing and crazy things with it. Okay, so at the question time, anybody in the chat room have any questions? Are you all still awake?
If you have any questions, feel free to unmute and ask them, or type them in the chat if you don't have a mic.
Yep, do that. If you have any, just want to tell me how great this session was, how it changed your life, or anything like that, feel free to unmute and do that too.
Hey, Todd.
Yes.
This is Jason. I'm curious if you've had experience with people sharing their Azure AD between SharePoint and IaaS. Are you aware of any issues with that?
No, and I think. So are you talking about they have one tenant and they're using the same users, or they're having multiple tenants, or what do you? What's the scenario there?
Well, ours is fairly complex. I'll try to keep the weeds out.
Dumb it down for me, then, Jason.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're doing a POC of Azure IaaS, and it just so happens that someone else on my team, so we're engineering, we bring new technologies to the company. Someone else is working on a SharePoint Online project, and so what we thought we would do is designate yet a third engineer to kind of manage the identity between all of this, right? Because he also happened to be the person who set up our federation and whatnot. So basically we're doing ADFS to Azure IaaS, and we are using Azure AD, and we are using AD Connect to sync the objects to it.
Excellent.
But yeah, so what we're wanting to do is basically share this one Azure AD subscription between our SharePoint Online instance and Azure IaaS. And I mean, we really have to, right? You can't register custom domains except once. Once you claim it, you're stuck. So that's kind of our situation.
Yeah, so I think so a couple of points. Like you said, you have to do it. so it's not whether, hey, should I do this or not? Well, yes, you should, because you have to. It's kind of like gravity in that regard. But I also think that it is just a good idea. And so I'm an IT pro. I think you're probably all IT pros. And the last couple of years have been kind of scary for us, because everything's going to the cloud and we're just not sure what our future looks like. Are we going to have to get real jobs now? Am I going to have to start learning how to make fries and flip burgers and things like that? It's been kind of scary. And I was at Ignite, and it just kind of hit me, and it had been kind of hitting. It had hit me a few times before Ignite, but I just hadn't noticed. Identity is kind of the next frontier for us. And so I've been hitting identity really hard the last few months. And I think the scenario that you have described, while it sounds terrifying, is exactly the best scenario that there is. Having all of your users in one spot in Azure AD, and then doing things like manipulating your licenses and things like that, is exactly how you'll control access to everything. But the great thing will be, as you have a user in there because they're SharePoint Online or whatever, if you guys decide to move to Exchange Online or Skype for Business or whatever, the users are already there. If they get a promotion and need access to something inside of IaaS, they're already there. You just have to light up the licenses and give them permission. So it's scary, and the whole identity thing and having somebody else own our identities is just flat out terrifying. But the more I've been doing with it, the funner it gets. the more I like it. And I've been playing around. Once you get your identities inside Azure AD, then you can do things like the Azure Application Proxy, which I'm pretty sure is just black magic. Like, I'm pretty sure there's no technical way to do this. But for those of you that haven't had the pleasure, Azure Active Directory or Azure Application Proxy is a way to publish things that are internal only. And so for me, it's SharePoint because everything's SharePoint. Like SharePoint that doesn't have access to the internet, that you can't get to from the internet, you can publish it through Azure. And so a user logs into an Azure web endpoint, and they can do this on their computer at their desk. They can do it from their computer at home. They can do it from their iPad or their whatever. They log into Azure with their Azure accounts, and then they have these things published to them, and they can get to SharePoint, or maybe just the SharePoint Central Admin or something like that through Azure without having a firewall with ports opened and crazy ACLs and stuff like that. And what makes that even cooler is you can say, okay, I'm Todd, I have access to Azure AD, and I get all kinds of stuff, access to all kinds of stuff. But if I connect to this specific thing, this central admin thing, this really important thing, when I connect to that, I need to use two-factor auth. I don't need to do it when I'm sitting at my desk, and I don't need to do it other times. But if I'm doing this highly privileged thing, now I need two-factor auth, and that's something that Azure AD gives you. And it's super easy to set up inside of Azure AD, to handle the phone and all that kind of stuff. So Jason, it seems a little scary and a little frightening right now, but little do you know, you're being exposed now to what the next great fun thing that you're going to do is, and it's going to be cool any day now if it's not already.
Nice. That's called Application Proxy, what you were just describing?
Yes, Azure Application Proxy. The other cool thing that you can do with Azure AD is, so Microsoft says there are 2,000 applications, but really there's only like 10 or 12 that are worth a hoot. But there are a bunch of applications that can use Azure AD. So if you guys, as a company, want to use Dropbox or Box or Concur or something like that, you can actually wedge that into Azure AD also. So now when users' passwords change and all that kind of stuff, it's all the same username, it's all the same password, and now Concur is the same user, and Box is the same user. And it's all being ran out of Azure AD.
Nice.
Anybody else? Fun stuff with PowerShell? Fun stuff with SharePoint? Fun stuff this summer? Going swimming? Anything like that? Sounds like I've either bored you all to death or have just so thoroughly covered this topic that there are no questions left.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank you, Todd, for taking the time to present for us. And to me, that was actually very informative because I haven't done a lot with Office 365 other than through my my account I get as being an MVP. And the only thing I've really done with Azure is build some VMs to test moving my blog to Linux VMs running in Azure. So the identity stuff is something that we may be interested in at one of the locations I support. So
and I've been hitting the identity thing a lot in my day job, so now I just want to chat about that a lot. So it's not strictly PowerShell, but Azure AD is free. Azure AD is free. There are 3 SKUs of Azure. Azure AD Free, Azure AD Standard, and Premium. Azure AD is free, and that is all you need to set up all this crazy syncing stuff. And so if you've heard about this and kind of want to play with it but don't want to spend a bunch of money, you can go out to Azure. You can sign up for Azure AD for nothing. And like Jason mentioned, to get the syncing working, you have to tie it to a publicly accessible internet domain. And so you'll need one of those. You can, if you buy it at GoDaddy, they'll wire it up automatically for you. But buy one of those domains, and then Azure Active Directory Connect is the software that you'll run on your Windows AD environment. But for virtually nothing, you can play with this and set it all up and start playing with these identities. You don't need licenses for any of this kind of stuff. You can create users without all that. And with Office 365, you can get I think a 90-day trial for free. So, and again, that'll wedge right into Azure AD. So you can play with all this stuff for little to no money. Jason's asking, anyone doing claims auth with social media? I have not done much with that. is a thing. Played with some of the demos, but that's about it.
Yeah, I was trying to think of a good use case for it. I don't know, maybe a sign-in book or some way to. Well, honestly, the first thing I think about is my sister's wedding. There were a ton of photos, and everybody wanted to see them, and everybody isn't everybody, right?
Yeah. So where are they at now? What platform are they on?
I ended up doing the old school sneakernet, but no, the idea was, hey, I'll throw this on the SharePoint side, I'll host it outside, and we'll have people sign in using their Facebook accounts, and one by one, I would authorize people. This would prevent them from having to have an actual AD account. And I could see companies benefiting from this as well with their own customers. Maybe not Facebook, maybe it's LinkedIn accounts, right? So
yeah. So that's another interesting thing, and again, I apologize, it has very, very little to do with PowerShell. But when you get into Azure AD and start doing things, you can create users in Azure AD. You can create users depending on how you got things wired up and your SKUs. You can create users for your domain in there, but you can also add external users. And so I don't remember what all the options are, but for like Hotmail users, Live, Passport, whatever they're calling them these days, you can add that user directly into Azure AD. So like my account is Todd_Klindt at hotmail.com. So I can add that account into Azure AD and then give that user permission to SharePoint. So for them, same username and password as they used to log into Skype or whatever, but now they can see pictures of your sister's wedding, my cats, all that. And I think there are ways to plug other authentication providers into that, maybe Facebook, whatever. I just haven't done it. The stuff I've been working on has been laser focused on Azure AD accounts, but I think you can wedge those other ones in there too.
Yeah, I think for us the biggest company use, business use case would be we have dealers. We have a dealer network. So, we have employees, but then we have these dealers that we might want to give access to a certain portion of our intranet. Don't want to give them AD accounts with, VPN access. Don't want to go crazy. So,
yeah, and that's one of the scenarios that I've been pitching to our customers. They've got these huge dedicated SharePoint farms that are not accessible from the internet. We've got an MPLS connection with them, and they're very tightly held. But yeah, there's this one contractor. We wish we could add him in, but then we got to create this other place, and then our internal folks have two sets of usernames and passwords. So now they can do this thing where they sync Windows AD up to Azure AD, and they do the hybrid thing with the SharePoint on-prem and the SharePoint Online, and now for the the extranet folks, create their identities only in Azure AD. Your users use their internal identities that are hooked up to Azure AD, so they use the same ones, and now the customer, the external folks can only get to SharePoint Online, and they can't wedge their way back through into the domain, but it's the same thing. People have been trying to do that for like 20 years, and various ways, VPNs and that kind of stuff. So that's one great scenario for Azure AD and SharePoint Online.
Hey, you just reminded me of a PowerShell question, actually.
Oh, well.
How about that? So, talking about all the 800 and something commandlets you get with on-prem, if you're in a hybrid scenario, do you get a little extra, maybe some commandlets that come with on-prem that you can actually use against the cloud?
No. So with SharePoint 2013, you need Service Pack 1 to do the hybrid stuff, and I don't even know, and the hybrid stuff is super weak with that, and I don't even know if you can configure the hybrid things with PowerShell, let alone use PowerShell to jump into hybrid. I think it's the mess that I've shown you in the last hour is all you have. SharePoint 2016, there's going to be a public beta of that coming out, and all they've said is it's going to be this month. They haven't said when. It could be any day now. Could have happened while we were on this, and I don't know if it's going to have any better solution for that. I'm guessing no, but so for those of you, I've been living this whole Microsoft Online thing for a while. With SharePoint Online and Office 365, Microsoft has two prevailing thoughts. Number one, they want to make that platform just as stable as possible at the cost of everything else, at the cost of functionality and all that. They want to make it stable, and they want to make it secure. They don't want anybody hacking it. They don't want anybody getting from one tenant to another. And so because of that, a lot of the things that we want getting in from the outside and all that, just they get shot down, unfortunately.
Do you suppose every time they apply a cumulative update or a patch or service pack that they're having to rebuild their profile services as well?
No, they don't. And I don't know if this has changed, but at the last SharePoint conference, they did a session on how they run SharePoint Online, and this may have changed since then, because that's been a year and a half ago. But the way they had it set up is they had a services farm that had search and user profile and all that for the tenants that it serviced, and then they had a farm that had all the tenants, and they didn't upgrade anything. They built a new farm with the new build version, and then they detached the databases and attached them to the new farm, and then upgraded them. But then that new farm used the same services database, so everything matched up. Services farm, so user profile.
When you have those resources, why not?
Well, so that's a funny thing. I've been doing, again, SharePoint for 12 years now, and there have just been a bunch of things that forever I've been screaming at the folks I know at Microsoft. This stinks about SharePoint. This is horrible. You guys got to fix this. And they're like, it's not that big a deal. And then they started hosting SharePoint. And suddenly some of these things became a big deal. So it's good to see them, addressing some of these needs, albeit, a decade late, but that's one of them. So they just shovel everything over. And so that's why you see like those commandlets for upgrading and all that, depending on how big the gap is, if it's a build to build or version to version. They can bring your database over, attach it to the new build, but not upgrade your site collection. And then you can use those commandlets to see if it'll upgrade and request the upgrade and all that. That's what those are. But that's how they did it a year ago. I don't know if that's still how they do it or not.
Nice.
Any other questions? All right, folks. Well, again, thanks to Ron and thanks to Mike for putting up with me. Mike sent a tweet out, I don't remember how long ago, saying, hey, we want some speakers, and I'm like, I would love to, and he humored me, he let me in, I appreciate it, and so it's been a pleasure chatting with you folks tonight.
Thank you, Todd. That was a wonderful presentation.
Oh, go on. All right, folks. Well, thanks. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect. So you've got me on Twitter at Todd Klindt. Shoot me a tweet, or you can email me at todd.klindt@rackspace.com.
Thank you again, Todd.
You bet. My pleasure.
Have a good night.
Talk to you later.